It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. Just a couple of nights under the stars with my girlfriend, Lucy, my best friend, Daniel, and his girlfriend, Sarah. Daniel and I had been friends since high school, and now that we all lived close enough, this trip felt like a natural way to reconnect. So, when my dad mentioned a secluded lake hidden deep in the forest upstate, it sounded perfect. Quiet, serene, far from city lights. Just us and nature. The lake was something my dad had discovered years back. He'd camped there a few times in his youth, and from the way he described it, the place sounded untouched and magical. Towering trees, crystal clear waters, and an eerie sense of calm that settles around you. In hindsight, I realized that sense of calm was more of a warning. But of course, we didn't see it that way. Not at first. We arrived late afternoon on a Saturday. The drive was rough, narrow dirt paths barely visible under the thick canopy, and my car struggled to make it through some parts. But when we arrived, the sight was worth it. The lake stretched wide, glistening under the fading sunlight. The trees seemed to lean in close, their shadows cast long over the surface of the water, which was still as glass. Lucy and Sarah squealed with excitement, running toward the shore to check out the water. Daniel and I set about unpacking our gear and picking a spot to set up our tents. I remember the way the air felt, thick, damp, and somehow off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I chalked it up to the dense woods and the lake's chill. Nature always has a way of being a little unsettling when you're out of your element. As the sun dipped lower, we got a small fire going. Daniel and I cracked open a couple of beers while Lucy and Sarah decided to take a quick swim before dark. They laughed and splashed each other, their voices echoing across the lake's quiet surface. Daniel and I watched them from the shore, grinning as they called out playful taunts. Then, Lucy screamed. It wasn't one of those playful, shrill laughs. This was different, guttural, piercing. My blood went cold. She thrashed, her arms flailing, and I saw her go under for a moment. I dropped my beer, sprinted to the shore, and dove in without a second thought. The water was colder than I expected, numbing, and when I reached her, she was struggling, trying to hold on to me as if something was pulling her down. "It's got my leg," she gasped, clawing at my shoulder. I kicked hard, trying to drag us both back to shore, but I felt something, too. A tight, cold grip around my ankle, like a vice, pulling, dragging. I yanked, and whatever it was finally let go, but I'd felt it, a hand. I was sure of it. We stumbled back onto the shore, gasping, shivering. My ankle was throbbing, and when I looked down, I saw a jagged cut, bleeding into the wet sand. Lucy's ankle had a similar wound, deep and dark, as though something sharp and unearthly had sliced through her skin. Daniel and Sarah rushed over, and we quickly tried to patch ourselves up with some gauze from the first aid kit. They peppered us with questions, but Lucy and I could barely speak. What could we say? That something had grabbed us? Something lurking under that still, silent water? The night deepened, and we sat around the fire, the mood now tense, hushed. We each held a beer, drinking in uneasy silence. No one wanted to be the first to bring up what had happened in the lake. We all just sat there, waiting for the feeling of dread to pass. Then we heard it, a soft splash, followed by a faint ripple across the lake. Daniel shone his flashlight toward the water, his hands trembling, and we all saw it, a figure, barely visible, just the head rising above the surface, watching us. The eyes, they glowed. Not like an animal's eyes reflecting light, but a faint, otherworldly glow that seemed to pulse, almost hypnotic. The face was mostly in shadow, but its gaze was fixed, unblinking, staring right at us. My heart hammered against my ribs. Daniel's voice came out in a shaky whisper. Did anyone else see that?" We all nodded, frozen, our minds scrambling for a rational explanation. But deep down, I think we all knew there wasn't one. Lucy grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave." "No," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. And she was right. The unease had turned to outright terror, and there was no way we could stay there, not with that thing watching us. We packed up as fast as we could, shoving what little we could into our bags, leaving everything non-essential by the fire. We stumbled back to the car, the forest around us feeling too close, too alive. I swear I could feel those eyes on us, even as we scrambled up the path to the car. The drive back was silent. No one spoke, each of us processing what we'd just seen, what we'd just felt. It wasn't until we were miles away, under the safety of streetlights, that anyone dared to break the silence. But no one had any answers. We just drove, hoping that by putting miles between us and that lake, we could put the memory out of our minds too. The next day, I told my dad about what happened. He didn't say much, but his face grew pale as I described the creature. He had no explanation, just a quiet shake of his head, as though he'd heard a story like this before but hoped he'd never have to hear it again. Later that day, Daniel and I went back to the lake to collect the rest of our gear. But when we got there, everything was destroyed. Our tents had been slashed to ribbons, our cooler overturned, its contents strewn across the dirt. It was like something, or someone, had torn through our campsite in a fit of rage. We never went back to that lake. None of us. To this day, I can't swim in open water without feeling a pang of terror, without wondering if there's something just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. Whatever it was that grabbed us, whatever it was that stared at us from the lake that night, it's still out there, hidden in the deep. I remember it as vividly as if it happened yesterday. It was a chilly November afternoon, and the air was thick with that autumn scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. I must have been no older than 8, and I was out in the front yard with my friends, Matt and Joey. We were just fooling around, doing what kids do, jumping into the piles of leaves we'd raked up, laughing as they scattered in all directions. It was my house, a cozy little place nestled on a sleepy cul-de-sac surrounded by big, old trees. The leaves blanketed our lawn, so we spent hours pushing them into heaps, then diving in, pretending to be explorers or soldiers. It was innocent, just kids playing. We didn't know any better. At some point, Joey let out a shriek. "Guys, come look at this!" he yelled, his voice a mixture of excitement and fear. Matt and I ran over, expecting maybe a lost toy or a strange bug. But no, it was something much stranger. There, partially buried under the leaves, was what looked like a mannequin, a fake body, arms spread out, face turned up to the sky. It was realistic enough to make us all stop dead in our tracks. The face was blank, but somehow it seemed ominous. And it wasn't a storm mannequin either. It had this rubbery, lifelike feel to it that made me uncomfortable just looking at it. We stood around it, unsure what to do, until a rustling sound from the bushes behind us made us all jump. I'll never forget the sight of the man who stepped out. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a gaunt, sunken face, eyes that bulged out slightly, and a crooked smile that showed teeth jagged and discolored. He was wearing a long, dirty coat that seemed too thin for the season, and he walked with a slight limp. "Been watching you boys," he said, his voice slow and gravelly. "You're having a good old time, huh?" He chuckled in a way that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a friendly chuckle. It was something else, something darker. The three of us stood there, paralyzed. Then Matt whispered, "Let's go." Without another word, we turned and bolted for my house, not even stopping to look back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Once inside, we ran to my dad and blurted out what we'd seen, talking over each other in our panic. My dad looked at us, eyebrows raised, then nodded slowly. "Stay here," he said in that stern, no-nonsense tone he used when he meant business. He grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, leaving the front door open just a crack. The three of us crowded by the door, peeking out to watch him as he scanned the yard with the flashlight. He swept it back and forth over the leaves, moved toward the bushes where the man had been, then stopped. My dad's shoulders stiffened, and he turned around, heading back inside. He closed the door firmly behind him. "There's nothing out there," he said, glancing at each of us with a skeptical smile. "No man, no mannequin, just a bunch of leaves. Maybe you boys' imaginations got the better of you." but we knew what we'd seen. And though he brushed it off, I could tell he felt uneasy. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little creak, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I'd pulled the blanket up to my chin, half expecting that strange man to suddenly appear in the doorway or by my bed. Just as I was drifting off, I heard something. A low, whispering sound, almost like someone talking just outside my window. My heart stopped. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear. "Hey, kid!" The voice was unmistakable. It was him. I sat up, not daring to move closer to the window. But I could hear him, clear as day. "I live right across the street, you know. Been watching you boys playing, seeing you jump in them leaves." My skin went cold. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then I heard scratching, soft at first, but growing louder, more desperate. He was trying to get in. I could hear him tapping on the window pane, and then the sound of his hands sliding along the glass, searching for a way in. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but still, I couldn't move. Finally, I managed to let out a strangled scream. "Dad! Dad!" I heard footsteps thundering down the hall, and my bedroom door flew open. My dad rushed in, looking around, then came to my side, pulling me into a hug. "What is it? What happened?" I pointed at the window, barely able to get the words out. "He's out there! He was trying to get in!" My dad's expression shifted from confusion to something close to anger. He went over to the window, threw it open, and looked outside. "There's no one there," he said, sounding both relieved and frustrated. But I knew he was there. I could still feel his presence, lingering, watching. The next day, my dad made a call. The police came by, took my statement, and promised to look into it. I think they assumed it was just a case of a kid's imagination running wild. But a few days later, something happened that changed everything. A squad car pulled up across the street, and 2 officers went into the house there. It turned out the man I'd seen wasn't just some harmless eccentric. They found him inside, sitting in a filthy room littered with empty bottles and strange powders. The police later told my dad he'd been under the influence of some drug, and his mind had been unwell, was the word they used. But that wasn't all. One of the officers pulled my dad aside to tell him more details, and I overheard a bit of it. Apparently, this man had been watching us for weeks, maybe longer. He'd even set up his own game in the bushes outside my yard. That fake body we'd found under the leaves? He'd put it there, some twisted bait to lure us in. They took him away that day, and I never saw him again. But the memory of those bulging eyes, that crooked smile, and the feel of his voice whispering outside my window, it's all still with me. This tale from 20 years ago isn't something I usually talk about. The details still make me uneasy, and reliving it isn't exactly my idea of fun. But sometimes, on a cold night, it feels like the memories come to me as vivid as the day it happened, so maybe sharing it now will ease some of that weight. I was about 20 years old, working off the books for a small media company. We were the kind of operation that never had a fixed schedule or predictable assignments. The job was straightforward: document untouched natural landscapes, dense forests, marshy areas, anywhere remote and undisturbed. The footage would then be pieced together as background material for environmental projects or local documentaries. The company didn't pay much, but I had no complaints. I loved being outdoors, and the freedom to explore new, wild places was a bonus. One early autumn day, I was sent out to a remote forested area near Maryland. It was beautiful: deep woods, a carpet of auburn leaves, towering trees casting long shadows as the sun began its slow descent. My assignment for the day was simple: capture some footage of the area. By the time I was wrapping up, it was late afternoon, the sun slipping lower and the shadows growing longer. I was tired, but satisfied with the footage I'd gotten. It was as I was packing up my camera that I realized I wasn't exactly sure which way led back to the trail I'd come in on. The trees had that unsettling sameness to them. Every path looked identical, and as the sky turned dusky, the entire place began to look foreign. I walked for what felt like hours, but my attempts to retrace my steps only led me deeper into the forest. My phone, unreliable in these remote areas, had no service, and I didn't have any GPS device. Nightfall was fast approaching, and it seemed I would be alone in these woods for a while longer. Just as the last light drained from the sky, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated house. I could barely see it through the trees until I was right up against it. The house looked like it had been left to the elements for decades. Weathered wood, cracked windows, a leaning porch. It gave off a feeling that was both eerie and oddly inviting, a quiet promise of shelter from the night. With no other options in sight, I decided I'd stay the night and figure out my way out in the morning. Inside, the house was just as time-worn as its exterior suggested. Dust blanketed every surface, and the stale air held a faint scent of rot and mildew. I made my way to a small bedroom upstairs with a rickety bed frame and an old, sagging mattress. Exhausted, I lay down without hesitation, pulling my jacket over myself for warmth. I figured I'd fall asleep and be out cold until sunrise. But then came a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible noise coming from the corner of the room. At first, I tried to brush it off, assuming it was the old house settling or maybe a draft causing the wood to creak. I lay there, eyes squeezed shut, hoping sleep would claim me. But the sound grew louder, a kind of low gurgling noise, guttural and unnatural. My skin prickled. I didn't dare open my eyes, convinced it was just some animal noise from outside, carried in on the wind. Then it stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. I forced myself to breathe evenly, trying to slow my racing heart. But then the sound resumed, louder this time, almost a wet choking sound, like something struggling to breathe. Against my better judgment, I opened my eyes and slowly looked toward the source of the noise, the closet at the far corner of the room. The closet door was slightly ajar, and as I stared, frozen in place, it began to creak open further, inch by inch. My mind was already racing with possibilities. A raccoon, a stray cat, some animal that had made a nest in the closet. But what emerged from that dark space was not an animal. He moved slowly, his body almost mechanical in its movements. His face, or what I could see of it under the smeared, ghostly makeup, was twisted into an unnatural grin, eyes wide and glistening. There was something hideously off about him. He looked like he was wearing a wig, an awful, disheveled one that didn't sit right on his head. His face, painted with garish makeup, was caught between a smile and a grimace, lips smeared with a sickly red. For what felt like an eternity, we simply stared at each other, him standing half in the closet, half out, as if deciding what to do next. I was paralyzed, my mind unable to process this figure in front of me. His chest rose and fell with that same grotesque gurgling sound, and then, he began to take slow, deliberate steps towards me. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed my bag and lunged for the door, all sense of exhaustion gone, my body moving on pure adrenaline. I bolted down the stairs, barely aware of my own movements, hearing his footsteps thundering after me. His breathing was loud now, that horrid, wet sound, punctuated by laughter that was low and guttural, like some sick imitation of a child's giggle. Out of the house and into the night I ran, my feet pounding the earth beneath me. The forest was pitch black, the canopy blocking what little moonlight there was. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of his pursuit closing in. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how far I ran or for how long, but at some point, I burst onto a narrow road, nearly stumbling as my feet hit the pavement. In the distance, I could make out headlights coming toward me, and I threw myself onto the road, waving my arms wildly. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a look of alarm on his face, rolled down his window, asking if I was all right. I didn't even try to explain. I just begged him to take me back to the town, and sensing my desperation, he nodded, ushering me into the passenger seat without another word. As the car pulled away, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see that painted face staring back at me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent woods. The man dropped me off at the gas station where my truck was parked, and as I climbed into the driver's seat, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I drove straight home, leaving that place in the dust, and spent the next few days trying to convince myself that it had all been some bizarre nightmare. But deep down, I knew it was real. That man, or whatever he was, had been real. I've been living alone with my 2 German shepherds, Jax and Rook, for about a year now in a quiet house near a nature reserve on Long Island. My girlfriend, Lauren, visits when she can, but she lives out of state, so I spend most nights with just the dogs for company. The solitude usually suits me. I'm a bit of a night owl, and the late hours give me time to write, work on projects, and unwind in peace. About a week ago, though, that peace was shattered. It started with a weird noise on a Tuesday night. I was just finishing up a project in my study, probably around 1 in the morning, when I heard Jax barking near the back door. This wasn't his typical. I heard a squirrel kind of bark. It was deeper, more urgent. When Rook joined in, I knew they'd heard something that didn't sit right with them. I got up and went to the back door to see if maybe a raccoon had wandered up onto the porch. But when I opened the door and flicked on the floodlight, there was nothing there, just the quiet expanse of the yard leading to the dark edge of the woods. The dogs eventually calmed down, but the barking started again the next night, and then the night after that. It was always around the same time, and they were always facing the woods, barking at something that I couldn't see. By the 3rd night, I was convinced there had to be something, or someone, out there. I mean, Jax and Rook aren't exactly the type to bark at shadows. So, that night, I decided I'd take Jax with me and go check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and clipped the leash onto his collar, leaving Rook in the house to keep an eye on things there. Jax seemed especially alert as we made our way across the yard, his ears pricked and his nose low to the ground. The woods were thick and dark, the air still in that way that only amplifies every little sound. I kept telling myself it was probably just a stray dog, or maybe a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Jax was pulling hard on the leash, practically dragging me toward the tree line. He's strong, and it took all my strength to keep him from bolting into the underbrush. But then he froze, his body tense, ears forward, eyes fixed on a spot deeper in the trees. He let out a low, rumbling growl, the kind he only makes when he feels seriously threatened. I tried shining my flashlight into the woods, but the beam barely penetrated the dense branches. I couldn't see anything. Then there was a crack, a branch snapping somewhere off to our left, close enough that I could feel my heartbeat pick up. Someone was out there. Or something. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound confident but probably failing miserably. "If you're out there, just leave now, and I won't call the cops." Silence. I stood there, listening, every muscle in my body tense. Then Jax barked, loud and fierce, his eyes locked on the darkness. And that's when I heard it, footsteps, crunching through the leaves, moving slowly, deliberately in our direction. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I tugged Jax's leash, pulling him with me as we backed up toward the house. I kept glancing over my shoulder, flashlight beams swinging through the trees, but I couldn't see anything until I did. 2 eyes, reflecting the light, low to the ground and watching us. But as I stared, I realized they were moving upward, rising higher and higher until they were at least 6 feet off the ground. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a deer. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. And then it stepped into the light. Just for a second, but long enough. Its body was long, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far, like they were built out of shadows. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was nothing but a gaping black maw, like the mouth of a cave, as if it could swallow the light itself. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. "Go!" I shouted at Jax, who was still barking furiously, his teeth bared. Together, we sprinted for the house, the hair on the back of my neck prickling with the feeling that we were being chased. I could hear it behind us, that crunching, relentless sound of footsteps keeping pace with us, like it was toying with the distance. close enough to terrify but not close enough to grab us. We made it to the porch, and I barely managed to get the door open before shoving Jax inside and slamming it shut behind us. My hands were shaking as I locked it, and when I looked back through the glass, I saw it there, just at the edge of the yard, standing like it was watching us. I could make out the twisted shape of it, arms hanging down like dark ropes, a head that looked too big for its thin neck, and that face, or lack of one, staring right at me. Rook was barking like crazy now, his teeth bared as he lunged at the door. I backed away, my mind racing with questions. What was it? A prank? Some sick joke? Then it started to move again, melting back into the shadows, its body twisting and stretching in unnatural ways as it faded into the trees. My skin crawled, but I couldn't tear my eyes away until it was completely gone. That night, I brought Jax and Rook upstairs to my room, bolting the door behind us and keeping the lights on. I tried to sleep, but every little noise set my nerves on edge. The next day, I called the police to report what I'd seen, but they didn't take it seriously. Maybe I didn't explain it well enough, or maybe they just thought I was imagining things. Either way, they didn't send anyone out to check. I haven't seen it again since that night, but the dogs have been on edge every evening, pacing the house, staring out the windows, and growling at things I can't see. Sometimes, I think I hear footsteps outside, soft and deliberate, but when I look out, there's nothing there. And yet, sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting just outside the reach of the light. It's only been a week, but I'm thinking about moving. Whatever that thing was, I don't want to find out if it's still out there, lurking in the woods, watching me, biding its time. The thought of facing it again, of looking into that dark, hollow face, fills me with a dread I can't shake. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never feel safe in my own home again. One chilly October night back in 2016, I found myself in a situation I'll never forget. At the time, I was working seasonally at a party city in a small, quiet town in the US, helping with Halloween sales. It wasn't my first year there, but this time, I'd been assigned to cover more of the night shifts, working up until 11 p.m. to restock shelves and help close up the store. This wasn't a huge store, and we didn't get a lot of customers that late. Most of the time, it was just the last-minute Halloween procrastinators or people browsing for spooky props and costumes. The thing about working these shifts was that, as the hours crept on and the store emptied, the whole place took on an eerie feeling. With all the Halloween decor, the skeletons, creepy clown masks, fake spiders, it didn't take much for your mind to start playing tricks on you. I tried to laugh it off, to keep the atmosphere light, but on that particular night, there was no laughing it off. It was already past 10 p.m., and the store was empty except for the few of us on the night shift. My main job that night was to clean up the costume section and bring up some restock items from the basement. There were only 3 of us working, the shift supervisor, Ashley, and a coworker named Tony who mostly handled stocking the shelves. I went down to the basement, which was always unsettling. The place had poor lighting, and the rows of metal shelves stacked with boxes seemed to stretch out forever in the dimness. The air felt heavy, like the whole basement hadn't breathed in years, and each step I took echoed off the walls, bouncing back to me with a strange, muffled quality. The place had a musty smell, too, like dust and old cardboard. The first thing I noticed was that the lights were off. I remember flicking the switch, and the fluorescent bulbs blinked a few times before humming to life. I took a deep breath, hoping to shake off the weird feeling that settled over me every time I was alone down there. I reminded myself it was just a basement, just a bunch of boxes and supplies. I went about finding the boxes Ashley had asked for, quickly scanning the shelves for the familiar labels. That's when I heard it. A strange, shuffling sound, like something was dragging across the floor just a few rows over. At first, I froze, straining my ears to listen. I held my breath, half expecting it to just be a trick of my imagination or a loose box settling on the shelf. But then the noise came again, and this time, it was more distinct, a soft thump-thump, like slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart rate picked up, and I did my best to shake off the chill that crawled up my spine. It's probably just Tony, I told myself, even though I knew that Tony was working on the opposite side of the store, nowhere near the basement. Still, I convinced myself someone must have come down without me noticing. I stepped out from behind the shelf I'd been working near and slowly peeked around the corner, squinting into the dimness. The air felt colder, heavier. And then I saw him. There, at the end of the aisle, maybe 20 feet away, was a tall figure dressed in a white cloak. It wasn't a costume we had in the store. No, this was something else. The figure was completely still, standing with a peculiar stiffness that gave off an unsettling, almost menacing aura. He wore a mask, a bone-white face with deep, hollow eye sockets and a gaping mouth, giving the impression of a silent, perpetual scream. But what really threw me off was the boots. They were old, beaten up, covered in what looked like dried mud. I stared at him, frozen, my mind racing through all kinds of explanations. Maybe it was Tony playing a prank. Maybe someone had come in and snuck down here. But then I noticed the height. He was taller than Tony by at least a few inches, his shoulders broader, more imposing. And Tony didn't own boots like that. Slowly, I backed up a step, hoping the figure wouldn't notice me, but as I moved, his head tilted slightly, as if he'd caught sight of me from the corner of his eye. A chill washed over me, and my instincts screamed to run. I turned and walked as fast as I could back toward the stairs, not daring to look back until I was in the relative safety of the main store floor. As soon as I was back upstairs, I sought out Ashley, who was adjusting some of the Halloween props near the entrance. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I think the look on my face gave me away. She looked at me, concerned, as I stumbled over my words, trying to explain that someone who definitely didn't belong there, was lurking down in the basement. She didn't seem to fully believe me but agreed to check it out. She called Tony over, and together, the three of us went down to the basement. I led the way, trying to ignore the dread pooling in my stomach. When we reached the aisle where I'd seen him, though, it was empty. Nothing but boxes, dim lights, and the stale, musty air. We checked the whole basement, every corner and shadowed row, but there was no one there. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been down there besides us. Ashley shrugged it off, muttering something about how the Halloween season always got people on edge. Tony laughed it off, saying he hoped it wasn't some crazy fan of the store. Trying to brush it off myself, I went back to work, even though the unease lingered. But I wasn't the only one who had felt something off. As we made our way back upstairs, Ashley mentioned checking the security cameras just in case. She led us to the small, windowless room near the back of the store where the security monitors were. We rewound the footage to the time I'd been in the basement. The grainy black and white feed showed me entering, and for a few minutes, nothing unusual happened. But then, I stopped on the footage right where I'd heard that first sound, frozen as though I sensed something. And yet, on the screen, no one else appeared. The aisle where I'd seen the figure was empty. Feeling increasingly disturbed, I finished the rest of my tasks as fast as I could, all the while keeping one ear open for any sound, any sign of movement. And then, just as I was about to leave the basement one last time to head back up, I heard it again, the faintest shuffle of footsteps behind me. This time, I forced myself to turn, and there he was, right at the bottom of the stairs, closer than before. He stood there, staring up at me, but the mask was gone. Instead, I saw a face, pale, thin, and stretched into the widest, most unsettling smile I'd ever seen. His eyes glinted with a malicious light, as though he was enjoying the fear in my face. My stomach churned with dread as I realized he was watching me, waiting for me to react. I didn't stay long enough to give him the satisfaction. I scrambled up the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste, and slammed the door behind me. Breathing heavily, I told Ashley and Tony what I'd seen, but when they went to check, he was gone. This time, though, we noticed something strange. The back door to the basement, which had been locked at the beginning of our shift, was now slightly ajar, as though someone had just slipped out. To this day, I have no idea who or what that figure was. Maybe it was someone who'd managed to sneak in and evade us all night. Or maybe it was something else, something not entirely human. I'll never know for sure, but every time Halloween comes around, I think back to that night and get a shiver down my spine. One crisp October afternoon, I found myself driving through winding country roads with a girl named Delilah. I'd met her only a few weeks earlier at a mutual friend's party. She was magnetic, with a laid-back, mischievous personality, and I quickly found myself drawn to her. We were heading out to pick apples. It seemed like the perfect fall date idea. The season's changing colors spilled across the landscape, and the air carried that faint sweetness of damp earth and fallen leaves. After about an hour on the road, we started to pass small apple orchards, some with signs advertising fresh cider and pies. Then we saw one that looked different. The orchard was set back a bit from the road, with thick rows of trees surrounding it like a natural fence. The wooden sign out front was faded, and the words, "Harlan's Orchard," were barely legible. It looked deserted, branches overgrown, apples scattering the ground. But something about it felt oddly magnetic, like it was asking us to stop, to explore. Delilah looked at me, a sly grin spreading across her face. "Let's go there. Bet we'll find the best apples in the forgotten orchards." With some hesitation, I pulled into the gravel path leading into the orchard. There was no one around, no parked cars, no hint of any recent visitors. I joked about this being the setup for a horror movie, but Delilah just laughed, saying, "Even better. Means we have the place to ourselves." The trees inside were dense, their branches heavy with clusters of deep red apples that seemed almost untouched. The ground was littered with fallen fruit, many of them shriveled or bruised, but a lot still looked good, almost too good, like they were waiting for someone to come and pick them. We started filling up a couple of baskets, laughing and racing each other to find the biggest, ripest apples. There was a strange silence in the orchard, though, no sound of birds, no wind through the leaves. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After a bit, we drifted apart in the rows, playing a half-hearted game of hide-and-seek, with Delilah ducking between the trees, calling out little challenges to me. I lost sight of her for a while and kept picking apples, thinking she'd pop out at any moment to scare me. Then my phone buzzed. It was a call from Delilah. Her voice sounded tight, breathless. "Hey, there's a guy here. He's been following me. Not saying anything, just standing there." She was whispering, as though afraid he might hear her. I felt a chill go down my spine. "Where are you?" "I'm by the old tractor near the east side," she said, barely audible. "Can you come here?" "Now?" I hurried over, my mind racing. When I got to the east side, I saw her standing rigidly, her eyes wide and fixed on a spot beyond the trees. I looked where she was staring and caught a glimpse of someone, just a silhouette of a young man, standing still among the apple trees, watching us. He didn't move, didn't respond when I called out, didn't even flinch. He just kept his eyes on us, his face shadowed by the branches. I grabbed Delilah's hand, and we started walking quickly back to the car, my heart pounding with every step. I glanced back once, and he was still there, standing in the same spot, like a statue among the trees. We reached the car and jumped in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, Delilah let out a strangled scream, pointing. The man had moved closer, almost close enough to touch the car now, his face finally visible in the dimming light. He looked gaunt, pale, his expression blank yet somehow intense, like he was seeing through us. I didn't wait. I floored the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped out of the orchard. The silence in the car was thick as we drove back toward town, both of us too shaken to speak. We tried to laugh it off eventually, convincing ourselves it was just some weirdo trying to scare us. But neither of us could fully shake the uneasy feeling. We ended up stopping at a small roadside stand, the kind where they sell pumpkins, cider, and apple preserves. 2 women were working there, elderly sisters, with warm, welcoming smiles. We struck up a conversation with them, and trying to make light of what happened, I asked if they knew anything about that old orchard. Harlan's orchard. I expected them to laugh and tell us it was just a rundown place, abandoned for years. Instead, the older sister's face fell. You kids didn't go in there, did you? Delilah and I exchanged a look. Why? She asked, her voice quiet. The sister sighed, glancing at her sister before speaking. That orchard belonged to old Mr. Harlan. Years back, his son, he was a troubled boy, had an argument with his girlfriend. She was found dead not far from that orchard, her body near the creek. They said it was an accident, but no one really believed it. The boy disappeared right after. Some folks say he ran off. Others say he's still around, hiding in the orchard, watching. My stomach twisted. You think he's still there? The sister just shrugged, looking back at me with a grim expression. We don't go near it, and we tell others to stay away. Mr. Harlan was never the same after it happened. He tended to that orchard alone for years. After he passed, no one's been in there since. We thanked them, bought a couple of apples, and drove home in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. I kept replaying the image of that man in my head, the hollow eyes, the pale face. It was like he didn't belong to this world, like he was stuck in that orchard, a ghost of something terrible. I guess it started innocently enough. For 15 years, my wife Ellen and I lived a quiet life on our little farmhouse in Chapel Hill, Tennessee. We bought the place in the early 2000s, enchanted by the wide open fields, the massive oak trees, and the hint of mist that hung low over the forest in the mornings. It was serene, isolated, the kind of place you'd raise a family if you wanted your kids to know what crickets sounded like on a summer night, or how to walk barefoot across freshly plowed earth. For the first 14 years, nothing strange ever happened. It was just me, Ellen, our son Jack, at least until he went off to college, and the calm predictability of rural life. But come February of 2019, something shifted in that calm, so slight at first, I almost thought I was imagining it. It started with Ellen waking me up one night, maybe around midnight. She'd heard a noise outside, near the window by the porch. I dragged myself out of bed, telling her it was probably just a raccoon or maybe the wind rattling the old wooden shutters. But when I went to check, I saw a thin scratch, almost a scrape, just under the window. Nothing that'd make you think twice in the daylight. But something about it felt off. Not like an animal scratch, more deliberate, like a claw or maybe a knife dragged just once across the siding. The next night, though, is when things got stranger. It was raining heavily, a cold downpour that seemed to hammer against every window, and in the middle of the night, we heard it again, a scratching sound, only louder this time. I got out of bed, pulling on my boots and jacket and grabbing the rifle I kept by the door. Ellen stayed behind, peering nervously through the living room curtains as I went out onto the porch. The rain was relentless, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But as I swept my flashlight across the side of the house, my heart dropped. The scratch from the night before? It was now a deep, jagged groove, like something had clawed through the vinyl siding. And then, in the mud just below it, I saw them, footprints, huge, and with deep, curved marks at the tips, almost like claws. They led away from the house, into the woods that bordered our property. I remember stumbling back inside, rain-soaked and unnerved, telling Ellen what I'd seen. She looked at me like I was insane, but the next morning, she saw it for herself, the deep gouges, the clawed footprints. We tried to tell ourselves it was a bear, a stray dog, or something that had wandered down from the hills, lost and curious. But somehow, neither of us really believed it. The third night was the worst. I remember because it was around 3 a.m. when I woke up with this strange, crawling feeling that something was wrong. The room was colder than usual, a damp chill that seemed to seep through the walls. I looked over at Ellen, but she was still asleep. Then I heard it, a soft creaking, the sound of something brushing against the window frame. Turning slowly, I looked over, and nearly screamed. The window was open, just a crack, and framed in that narrow gap was a face. Or what I thought was a face. It didn't have clear features, nothing that looked remotely human, The skin, if you could call it that, was a pale, mottled gray, stretched too tight over something that seemed half-formed. The eyes, or rather the deep, hollow spaces where eyes should have been, stared back at me, empty and blank. And the smell, a rancid, earthy stench like rotting leaves mixed with damp soil, filled the room. I couldn't move. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached, slowly, for the rifle by the bed. I didn't dare look away, fearing that if I did, it might somehow come closer, slip inside. But before I could grab the gun, it vanished, slipping back into the darkness as if it had never been there. I don't know if I screamed or if the cold fear in my throat had choked off any sound, but somehow, Ellen woke up. She took one look at my face and didn't ask any questions. We didn't sleep the rest of the night, just sat there in the dark, waiting for the dawn. By morning, we'd packed our things, deciding to sleep in Jack's old room, barricading ourselves inside with the windows locked and a chair wedged under the doorknob. We never saw it again, whatever it was. But that house, our home, never felt safe again. Ellen and I still talk about it sometimes, in whispers, as if saying it too loudly might call it back. I've since boarded up that window, replaced the vinyl siding, and tried to move on. But there are nights when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering those empty eyes and the sickly gray skin, the sense of something ancient and unknowable pressing in from the dark. We haven't told many people this story, mostly because who'd believe us? But I still wonder what it was, lurking out there in the woods, and what might have happened if I hadn't woken up that third night, if we hadn't left that room. I was 19, still green around the edges and clueless about how much the world could mess with your head. That summer, I took a job as a camp counselor in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, figuring it'd be an easy gig and, to be honest, just wanting to escape home for a while. Camp Cedarwood was an old place, nestled deep in pine-covered hills, bordered on one side by a lake that never really warmed up, even in the height of July. The kids came and went in waves. Each week, a new batch would arrive, bright-eyed and loud, shuffling out of vans with suitcases nearly as big as them, as parents looked half relieved to see them go. Most weeks went by without anything out of the ordinary happening: scraped knees, bug bites, homesick tears. It was normal. Until it wasn't. It was the last week of camp, a muggy night in August. I remember because the air was thick, humid in a way that almost made it hard to breathe, and the sun was dipping low, casting shadows that stretched long and dark across the grounds. I was on evening duty, walking the paths between the cabins, checking on things before the campers turned in for the night. That's when I saw her. A little girl stood alone, just outside the cabin where the younger boys stayed. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her frame so slight she almost seemed like a wisp of smoke against the trees. Her hair was a messy tangle of curls that hung down to her shoulders, and she was wearing a blue dress that looked out of place, old-fashioned, like something you'd see in a black and white photograph. It was a little odd, but you see all kinds of odd things at camp, and I figured she was just lost or looking for someone. "Hey there," I called, walking up slowly. "You okay?" She didn't answer, just looked at me with these wide, unblinking eyes. Up close, she seemed almost unreal, like one of those creepy porcelain dolls you'd see in antique shops. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, though I couldn't say why. "What's your name?" I tried again, crouching down to her level, putting on my best counselor smile. "Wella," she said, her voice soft, almost like a whisper. "Hi, Wella," I replied. "Where's your group? You shouldn't be out here alone." She didn't respond, just stared at me with that strange, hollow look. For a second, I thought maybe she was one of the kids from the day program. They sometimes wandered away from their groups if a counselor wasn't paying attention. But day campers were long gone by sunset. I decided to bring her inside the boys' cabin and have her sit on one of the bunks while I figured out where she was supposed to be. I figured I'd go check with the main office. They had records on every camper, and someone was bound to know where this kid belonged. But when I came back to the cabin, Willa was gone. I checked under the bunks, thinking she might be playing a prank, but the room was empty. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stepped outside, looking around, calling her name. There was no answer, only the fading light and the quiet hum of crickets. The shadows were thicker now, casting an eerie stillness over the camp. And then I heard it, a scream. It was faint, like it was coming from deep in the woods, but unmistakably the scream of a little girl. My gut twisted. I bolted toward the sound, the pine needles crunching under my feet as I called her name, my voice rising with a note of desperation. Wella! Wella! The scream came again, closer this time, pulling me deeper into the trees. I could barely see, the thick branches forming a canopy above, blocking out what little light remained. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I stumbled forward, branches scraping against my arms. I pushed through, calling her name again and again. Finally, I saw her. Willa was standing by an old tree, her pale face turned toward me, her eyes still that same unblinking, empty stare. I was about to run to her, to grab her and carry her back to camp if I had to, but then, without a word, she turned and darted into the darkness. I didn't think, I just followed, crashing through the brush, shouting for her to stop. She was fast, slipping through the trees like a shadow, barely making a sound. It didn't make sense. No kid that young should be able to move like that. Then, ahead of me, I caught sight of something, a faint, red glow cutting through the blackness. My steps slowed, a chill washing over me as I realized it was coming from an old cabin, one I hadn't seen before, hidden deep in the woods. The place looked abandoned, its windows broken, its walls covered in moss. But there was light coming from inside, casting an eerie, pulsing glow. And standing in the doorway was a man. He was tall, his face hidden in shadow, and he was just standing there, watching me. I couldn't make out his expression, but something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong here. A sick feeling twisted in my gut, the kind you get when you're sure something bad is about to happen. Then it hit me, Willa. She'd led me here. But why? Was she in danger, or was there something else going on? My mind raced, piecing together fragmented thoughts. What if she'd been a lure, some kind of trap? Fear took over. I turned on my heel and ran, not looking back, not daring to breathe until I was out of the woods and back on campgrounds. By the time I stumbled into the main office, I could barely get the words out. I told the camp director everything, about Willa, about the scream, about the man in the cabin. They called the police, and within an hour, the place was swarming with officers, flashlights combing the woods, voices crackling over radios. I told them exactly where I'd seen her, described the man and the strange red glow. They searched the woods for hours, even brought out dogs, but they didn't find a thing. No cabin, no man, no Willa. When they asked me to describe her, I felt a strange hesitation. I realized I couldn't recall her face clearly anymore. It was like it had slipped from my memory, leaving only a vague impression, a blur of pale skin, dark eyes, a blue dress. The camp director chalked it up to stress, said maybe I'd imagined it. But I knew what I'd seen. The police left empty-handed, and the camp resumed as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me in those woods, something that wanted me to follow it. A few nights later, after camp had officially ended and the last group of kids had gone home, I took a walk back toward the woods. It was late, nearly midnight, and the campgrounds were deserted. The quiet was unsettling, the shadows thicker than I remembered. As I approached the tree line, I heard a faint voice, almost too soft to hear over the wind. "Come play with me." My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to convince myself that it was the wind, just the wind, nothing more. But then, in the darkness, I saw it, the faint red glow, pulsing between the trees. I didn't wait to see what was on the other side. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run before, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, heart pounding as I bolted back to my car. I never returned to Camp Cedarwood after that. Didn't answer calls from the camp director, didn't keep in touch with the other counselors. It was one of those chillier autumn nights when the air feels sharp, and a strange sort of quiet settles in the air. I had just spent the evening out at a local bar with a few friends. Nothing wild, just a few drinks and laughs to break up the week. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night and walked back to my apartment building. I lived in one of those modern buildings that promise security with keycard access and 24-hour surveillance. The type of place where nothing out of the ordinary should ever happen. As soon as I got inside, I could feel the warm air comforting me after the brisk walk. I kicked off my boots, gave my chihuahua, Pepper, a quick pat, and settled in for the night. Pepper is a small dog with a big attitude, a bark louder than he is tall, and he seems to think he's much bigger than his 6 pounds. I remember barely making it to my bed before my eyes started to close. Within moments, I drifted into that half-sleep, the kind where you're aware of the sounds around you but not really awake. It must have been around 2:30 a.m. when something pulled me out of my sleep, a low growl coming from somewhere in the darkness of my bedroom. It took me a second to remember where I was, and when I did, my heart started to beat faster. The growling was coming from Pepper, who was at the foot of my bed, staring at something across the room. I rubbed my eyes and followed his gaze to the closet door. It was slightly open. I'm meticulous about keeping my closet shut, mostly because I'm a bit of a neat freak, and I never leave it open. Pepper's growling grew a little louder, more insistent, as he stared at that small crack in the door. I remember feeling a wave of unease settle over me. I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand, using its dim light to guide me as I slid out of bed. The room was dead silent except for Pepper's growling. I padded softly across the carpet, half hoping I'd see nothing but clothes and boxes inside. But the fear started creeping in, cold and paralyzing. When I was close enough to reach the closet, I paused, every nerve on edge. I took a deep breath and threw the door open in one swift motion, phone light directed inside. Nothing. Just the usual rows of clothes, stacked boxes, and shoes. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a bit silly for being so scared, and gave Pepper a gentle pat on the head to calm him. "See, buddy? Nothing there." But Pepper wasn't convinced. He kept staring at that closet even as I shut the door and turned to go back to bed. I could feel the tension in my chest start to ease as I climbed back under the covers, pulling them up close. Pepper finally lay down beside me, curling up at my feet. Maybe 10 minutes went by. I was just beginning to drift off again when I felt Pepper shift at the end of the bed. His tiny body went tense, and then came that low, rumbling growl once more. This time, he wasn't looking at the closet. He was staring down at the floor, right at the edge of the bed. My heart pounded. I thought of all the horror stories I'd read, the movies where the creeping something lurked right under the bed. I thought, no way this is happening. But Pepper wouldn't stop. He seemed almost frozen, his eyes locked on whatever was below. I was paralyzed with fear, my brain racing through every possible scenario. Finally, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my shaky hands, and slid out of bed as quietly as I could. I made my way to the kitchen, feeling around in the dark for something heavy or sharp, just in case. My fingers finally closed around the handle of a kitchen knife. I held it tightly, feeling a slight tremor in my grip. In the back of my mind, I told myself that it was probably just my imagination, that Pepper was just on edge for some random reason, maybe the scent of a mouse or something. But that little voice, the one that always keeps you safe, told me to check. Just one look, and I'd have peace of mind. I walked back into the bedroom, moving slowly and carefully. Pepper was still in the same spot, watching the edge of the bed like he was waiting for something, or someone, to make a move. I crouched down slowly, heart hammering in my chest, and angled the phone light down to get a look under the bed. At first, I didn't see anything. Just darkness, the outline of stray socks and dust. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. The outline of a person's hand. Fingers curled slightly, almost as if they were waiting to grab something, or someone. In that split second, 100 thoughts went through my mind. Run, my mind screamed, but I was rooted to the spot. I could barely process what I was seeing. There, underneath my bed, was the figure of a man, lying perfectly still, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. I forced myself to swallow a scream, my whole body going cold with terror. I grabbed Pepper as fast as I could, clutching him to my chest as I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran out into the hallway, my heart racing as I banged on my neighbor's door, praying they'd wake up. The neighbor, Mrs. Green, a sweet lady in her 60s, opened the door looking alarmed, and I rushed to explain what had happened, my words coming out in a frantic jumble. She didn't question me, didn't waste a second. She took me in and immediately called the police. It felt like forever before they arrived, though it was probably only a few minutes. When the officers finally showed up, they went inside my apartment to check the bedroom. I stayed back, clutching Pepper to my chest, his little heart beating just as fast as mine. One of the officers finally emerged, his face set in a grim expression. "Ma'am, it looks like whoever it was, they're gone now. There's no one under the bed. But we did find signs of forced entry through your bedroom window." My legs went weak, and I had to steady myself against the wall. The idea that someone had been watching me, lying in wait in the shadows while I was just feet away, it was too much to bear. The officer suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, and Mrs. Green kindly offered her couch. I couldn't sleep a wink. Every creak, every whisper of wind made me jump. The next morning, the police came back to do a more thorough search. They found footprints, fingerprints, but as far as I know, they never found the man. He had disappeared, leaving nothing but a nightmarish memory behind. I'm still shaken by it, even now. I moved out of that apartment building as soon as I could, into a place with better security, and honestly, more neighbors. The worst part, though, is knowing how close I came to. I don't know. To something awful. If it hadn't been for Pepper, my brave little guard dog, I might have gone back to sleep, never knowing there was a stranger hiding, waiting, beneath my bed. When I was 15 years old, my family lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Austin, Texas. It was one of those places where every house looked similar, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where the worst thing you expected was someone stealing your Amazon packages. It was safe, at least that's what I believed. That belief was shattered one humid summer night. It was a Friday, and my parents were out for dinner with friends, leaving me home alone. I didn't mind. It wasn't my first time being by myself, and honestly, I enjoyed the quiet. I spent most of the evening lounging in my room, listening to music, and scrolling through my phone. Around 8:45 p.m., I decided to take a quick shower before settling in for the night. I remember stepping out of the bathroom, still damp, when I heard a sound that made my stomach drop, the distinct creak of the front gate opening. My heart raced. At first, I told myself it was probably the wind or maybe a stray animal. But then came the low, guttural growl of my dog, Max, from the living room. Max was a German shepherd, big, protective, and not one to bark without a reason. His growls quickly escalated into frantic barking. Something, or someone, was outside. Still wrapped in my towel, I tiptoed to my bedroom window, which overlooked the front yard. My breath hitched when I saw a shadow dart past the streetlight and into our backyard. Whoever it was moved unnaturally fast, their lanky silhouette hunched like they were trying to stay hidden. I froze. My parents always told me to keep the doors locked when I was home alone, and thank God I had listened. I grabbed my phone off the bed and dialed my mom's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think rationally. Should I call the police? What if it was just a prank? Before I could decide, the doorbell rang. The sound was jarring, cutting through the tense silence. Max sprinted to the front door, barking like a maniac. My hands trembled as I approached the living room, peering cautiously through the peephole. A man stood on the porch. He looked normal enough, mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing a button-up shirt and jeans. But something about him felt off. His smile was too wide, his eyes too sharp, like he was forcing an air of friendliness. "Hey there," he called out, his voice casual. "Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for my friend. He's been acting kind of strange tonight. You haven't seen anyone running around, have you? Friend? My mind flashed to the shadow in the backyard. Was he talking about the person I had seen? Something didn't add up. No, I lied, my voice shaky. I haven't seen anyone. The man nodded slowly, his smile never faltering. All right, well, if you do see him, let me know. He might be dangerous. Been acting all sorts of weird, you know? Drugs, maybe? He lingered on the porch, as if waiting for something. I clutched the phone in my hand, ready to call for help, when he finally turned and walked down the steps. I exhaled shakily, but my relief was short-lived. Instead of leaving, the man circled around to the side of the house, the same direction the shadow had gone earlier. My blood ran cold. I locked the back door and every window I could find. Max followed me closely, his ears pinned back and his growl low and steady. Then, through the sliding glass door in the kitchen, I saw them, two figures standing in the backyard. The first was the man from the porch. The second was the person I had seen earlier, and up close, they were even more terrifying. Their skin was pale to the point of looking sickly, their long, greasy hair hanging in front of their face like a curtain. They wore all black, their clothes torn and dirty, and they swayed slightly, like they were struggling to stay upright. The man gestured toward the house, speaking to the pale figure in hushed tones. Then he looked directly at me through the glass door. My heart stopped. Had he seen me? I ducked out of sight, pressing my back against the wall, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. Hey! The man's voice called out from the other side of the door. Can you open up? He's scared of houses, you know? Won't calm down unless you come outside and talk to him. I didn't respond. My fingers hovered over the keypad of my phone, ready to dial 911, but something stopped me. I wasn't sure what. Maybe it was the way his tone shifted, from casual to insistent. Or maybe it was the fact that the pale figure, his supposed friend, was now staring at the door with an eerie, unnatural stillness. Listen, the man said, his voice turning sharp. If you just step outside for a second, this will all be over. We don't want any trouble. I felt like I was in a nightmare. My instincts screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but open that door. But I couldn't leave Max. He was my anchor, growling steadily at my side. Before I could react, there was a loud bang on the glass. I flinched, turning to see the man slamming his hand against the door. Open the door! He shouted. I bolted toward the front of the house, locking myself and Max in the small guest bathroom. My hands fumbled with the lock on the door as I finally called 911, whispering frantically to the operator. I'm home alone, I said, my voice shaking. There are two men outside my house trying to get in. The operator stayed on the line with me, assuring me that officers were on their way. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, listening to the muffled sounds of footsteps outside. Then, suddenly, it went quiet. When the police arrived, the two men were gone. The officers found footprints in the backyard and marks on the glass door where the man had hid it, but that was it. They searched the neighborhood but found no sign of them. Before they left, one of the officers mentioned that there had been a break-in reported just an hour earlier, only a few streets away. The homeowners had come face to face with two intruders, a man and a pale, sickly figure, and had barely managed to escape unharmed. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. What did they want? Why did the man call the other his friend one moment and a dangerous stranger the next? I never found out. But one thing still haunts me to this day. The pale figure never said a word. They just stood there staring. And their eyes didn't look human. You know those places in town everyone talks about but no one really dares to go? Well, for us, it was the nursery. An old, crumbling building tucked away in the woods behind our high school. Built in the 1930s, it had been a daycare for kids during the 1940s. But by the time we got to high school, it was nothing more than a ghost of its past, a forgotten relic, rotting and fenced off like the town's dirty little secret. That Friday started off like any other. We were sitting in Mr. Calhoun's history class, zoning out as he droned on about the Great Depression. Our group, me, Theo, Morgan, Elle, and the class clown Vincent, were huddled together in the back corner, whispering about weekend plans. The idea to explore the nursery came out of nowhere. "I bet you will last 5 minutes in that place," Vincent sneered, his trademark grin plastered across his face. Elle rolled her eyes. "Please! You're the one who'd chicken out the second you hear a floorboard creak." Morgan nudged me. "What about you, Alex? Think you can handle it?" I wasn't exactly the adventurous type, but I hated being the odd one out. "Sure," I said, feigning confidence. "Let's do it." That was how we found ourselves on the secret trail behind the school later that night. The woods were eerily quiet, our flashlights barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. The fence surrounding the nursery loomed ahead, rusted and bent in places, as if time itself was trying to swallow it whole. Vincent, of course, was the first to scale it, landing on the other side with a loud thud. One by one we followed. "Locked as expected," Theo muttered as he jiggled the door handle. His voice had an edge of nervousness to it. "No problem," Vincent said, already picking up a loose rock. He smashed a small window near the back, and we all cringed at the sound, like it might summon some long-forgotten caretaker. "Ladies first," he joked, gesturing to Elle and Morgan. They climbed in, followed by Vincent and Theo. I went last, hoisting myself up and over the jagged glass. But as soon as my feet hit the dusty floor inside, something felt off. The air was thick, stale, carrying an almost metallic tang. I called out to the others, but the room was empty. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and scattered debris, but no sign of my friends. "Guys?" My voice echoed in the silence. A faint giggle came from down the hallway, followed by hurried footsteps. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "They're messing with me," I thought, steeling myself as I stepped into the corridor. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, with doors lining both sides, each leading to what must have been classrooms or playrooms. The floors creaked beneath me, every step amplified in the suffocating stillness. My flashlight caught a mural on the wall, smiling children holding hands beneath a bright sun. The paint had faded, and the children's faces had decayed into grotesque smears. I turned a corner and stopped dead. At the end of the hall was a room with its door slightly ajar. Light from the full moon streamed through the cracked window, illuminating a figure standing inside. My heart nearly stopped. It was Theo, or at least it looked like him, standing perfectly still, facing the window. "Theo?" My voice cracked. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Before I could reach him, a loud crash echoed behind me. I spun around, heart racing. The sound had come from another room down the hall. I turned back to the window, but Theo, if it had even been him, was gone. Panic started to set in, but before I could process what was happening, the door to the room I just passed slammed shut. My flashlight flickered, the shadows around me dancing as if they were alive. Then, out of nowhere, Vincent, Morgan, and Elle jumped out, laughing hysterically. "You should have seen your face," Vincent wheezed, clutching his sides. My relief quickly gave way to anger. "What the hell, guys? That wasn't funny." "Oh, come on, Alex," Elle said, grinning. "You have to admit we got you good." I was about to argue when Morgan frowned. "Wait, you said you saw Theo?" "Yeah," I said, pointing toward the room at the end of the hall. "He was right there." Her face went pale. "Theo was with us the whole time." The laughter died instantly. We all turned toward the room. It was empty, but the feeling that we were being watched was overwhelming. "Let's just check it out," Vincent said, though his usual bravado was clearly faltering. As we approached the room, Elle gasped and pointed. There, in the corner, was a faint outline of a figure, someone or something crouched behind the door, their face pressed against the narrow gap, staring at us. My blood turned to ice. "Run!" Morgan whispered, and we didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted down the hall, back to the window we climbed through. Vincent went first, then Morgan and Elle. I was last, my hands trembling as I gripped the frame. Just as I was about to pull myself through, I felt it, a hand brushing against my ankle. I kicked out wildly, scrambling to the other side. When I turned back, there was nothing there. We didn't stop running until we were back at Morgan's house, gasping for air and too shaken to speak. When we finally told her older brother what had happened, he just shook his head. "You guys are idiots," he said. "Everyone knows you don't mess with the nursery. They say the kids that used to go there, well, not all of them made it out. And some of them never left." That was the last time we ever talked about it. None of us ever went back, and I can't even bring myself to walk past the woods anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of faint giggling or the creak of floorboards. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know better. Some things are better left forgotten. It was a quiet Thursday evening in early autumn, and the chill in the air hinted at the coming of winter. My mom, a nurse, was working the night shift at the hospital, as she often did. Both of my older brothers were away at college, leaving me alone in the house, a 2-story suburban home nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac in a sleepy American town. Being alone didn't bother me much. I was used to it. In fact, I'd planned a laid-back night, invited a few friends over to watch a baseball game, drink some beers, and unwind. They came, we laughed, cheered, and yelled at the TV as the game reached its tense final innings. By the time they left, it was nearly midnight. They filed out through the back door, which led to the yard. I bid them good night, locked the screen door behind them, or so I thought, and began tidying up. The house felt eerily quiet after the buzz of laughter and conversation earlier. I carried empty beer bottles to the kitchen, rinsed a few dishes, and made a mental note to properly clean up in the morning. After putting the remaining beer in the fridge, I climbed the stairs to my room, my body heavy with exhaustion. As I slid under my covers, I was ready to surrender to sleep. But just as I started to drift off, a faint creaking noise jolted me awake. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained my ears. The sound was soft, rhythmic, like footsteps on the staircase. For a moment I froze. Then logic kicked in. Mom must have come home early. Maybe one of her patients canceled, or the hospital didn't need her after all. That thought brought me some relief. I even heard her familiar cough as she walked past my room and into the bathroom. The water in the pipes groaned as she turned the faucet on. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, this time heading downstairs. But they weren't as deliberate as her usual stride. They sounded uneven, like she was dragging her feet. Then came a loud crash from the kitchen, a metallic clattering that echoed through the house. I bolted upright, now fully alert. My first instinct was irritation. Why is she being so noisy? I grabbed my phone and sent her a quick text. "Hey, I'm trying to sleep. Keep it down, please." Almost instantly, I heard hurried footsteps thudding up the stairs. They were heavier than before, more forceful. My heart thumped as I stared at the doorway, waiting for her to appear and explain herself. The door creaked open. Standing there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light, was someone who looked like my mom. Same height, same build, but there was something off. Her hair was disheveled, and her posture was hunched. She didn't move or say anything, just stood there, breathing heavily. A sense of unease washed over me. My phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. It was a reply from Mom. "What are you talking about? I'm still at work. Everything okay?" My stomach dropped. My breath caught in my throat as my mind raced to process the horrifying realization. Whoever was standing in my doorway wasn't my mom. I looked up, and the figure stepped into the room. Under the pale glow of my bedside lamp, I could see her more clearly. It was an elderly woman, her white hair tangled and wild. Her skin was pale and sagging, her eyes sunken but wide with a strange intensity. She opened her mouth, and in a raspy, trembling voice, she muttered, "Don't know where to go." My body was frozen in fear. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She took a step closer, her bony hands reaching out toward me. The air in the room felt suffocating, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. Somehow, I managed to snap out of it. I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand and flicked it on, bathing the room in light. The woman flinched, her face contorting in what looked like pain or anger. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice finally finding its strength. "Leave me alone!" She didn't respond. Instead, she shuffled closer, her outstretched fingers nearly brushing the edge of my blanket. In a blind panic, I leaped out of bed, shoved past her, and bolted out of the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The woman banged on the door from the other side, her frail yet determined fists pounding against the wood. Fumbling with my phone, I called my mom. My voice was trembling as I told her what was happening. "Call the police!" I begged her. She stayed on the line with me, her own voice shaking as she assured me that help was on the way. Meanwhile, the banging stopped. My heart raced as I listened for any sign of movement. Then I heard it, the creak of the stairs. She was heading back down. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. When I finally heard the wail of sirens outside, I ran to the window and waved frantically. The officers entered the house with flashlights drawn. Moments later, I heard a commotion downstairs, a struggle, shouts. I peeked out of my room and saw them leading the woman out in handcuffs. Even as they escorted her past me, she kept muttering the same phrase. "Don't know where to go. Don't know where to go." One of the officers stayed behind to take my statement, while the others searched the house. They found the back door unlocked. Apparently, after my friends left, I hadn't locked it properly. That was how she'd gotten in. Later, I learned that the woman had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility. She wasn't dangerous, they said, just confused and scared. But that knowledge didn't make me feel any safer. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the house made my heart race. I would check and recheck the locks on every door and window, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night just to be sure. It was 2009, a chilly Thursday afternoon in late October, during my last year of high school. The final class of the day was English, and our teacher, Mr. Peterson, was his usual strict self. Halfway through the lesson, the projector stopped working. He sighed in frustration, muttering about how unreliable technology always ruined his lesson plans. Then he turned to the class and asked for a volunteer to go fetch a laptop from the library. I raised my hand without hesitation. Not because I was a model student, but because I needed an excuse to slip out and use the bathroom. The library was at the far end of the building, and with the renovations underway, it had been closed off for weeks. Still, Mr. Peterson assured me the laptops were accessible, stored in the usual room behind the main desk. The hallway leading to the library felt unusually quiet. Most of the noise from students had died down, and only the faint hum of the school's fluorescent lights accompanied me. As I turned the corner, I saw the large, "Closed for renovation" sign taped across the library doors. Oddly, the doors weren't locked, just slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The moment I entered, a wave of unease hit me. The library was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of light filtering through a cracked window at the far end. Rows of bookshelves loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching across the walls. The familiar smell of old paper was overpowered by a damp, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. I made my way to the back room where the laptops were usually stored. The door was locked. Frustrated, I jiggled the handle a couple of times, hoping it was just stuck. No luck. "Hello?" I called out, hoping a staff member might still be around. My voice echoed in the emptiness, but there was no response. As I stood there, debating whether to head back empty-handed, I heard it. Click, click, click. A faint, rhythmic noise coming from somewhere nearby. It was so steady that, at first, I thought it was a mechanical sound, maybe part of the renovation equipment. But as I listened closer, it became clear this wasn't machinery. The sound had an almost deliberate quality to it, like someone was flipping through the pages of a book in an eerie, measured cadence. The noise seemed to be coming from a small room near the far corner of the library. Cautiously, I approached. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the faint outline of something, or someone, standing inside. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I pushed the door open just a little further. The room was dark, but I could make out a figure. At first glance, it looked human, tall and unnervingly still, standing in the farthest corner of the room. But something about its proportions was wrong. Its head was far too large, grotesquely disproportionate to its thin, elongated body. It stood at least 7 or 8 feet tall, its silhouette casting a shadow that stretched toward me. I froze. "Excuse me, do you work here?" I asked, forcing the words out despite the lump in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. I should have left right then, but some morbid curiosity rooted me in place. I stepped into the room, my hand instinctively reaching for the light switch. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the sound stopped. Click. Dead silence. I flipped the switch, but the light didn't come on. Is everything okay?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper now. That's when it moved. The figure shifted ever so slightly, its massive head tilting to one side, as if observing me. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out along my spine. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. Something inside me snapped. I turned and bolted out of the room, my shoes squeaking against the polished floors as I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as I reached the main corridor, I nearly collided with Mrs. Clark, the hall monitor. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, her sharp tone cutting through my panic. "There's someone in the library," I managed to gasp. "Something's not right in there." Mrs. Clark frowned. "The library's off limits. What were you doing in there?" "I was sent to get a laptop, but the storage room was locked and I heard something. Saw someone." She narrowed her eyes at me, clearly unconvinced, but sighed and motioned for me to follow her. "Come on. Let's take a look." We returned to the library, and this time the lights were on. The space looked completely normal, quiet, orderly, and empty. "I swear there was someone in that room," I insisted, pointing toward the corner. Mrs. Clark marched over and pushed the door open. The small room was empty. No towering figure. No eerie clicking sounds. Just an ordinary storage room with a couple of old desks and chairs. "You imagined it," she said flatly, crossing her arms. "Get back to class." "But..." Now. Reluctantly, I returned to class, but the incident stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling of those unblinking eyes watching me, the unnatural stillness of that towering figure. Later that evening, I overheard a conversation between 2 janitors in the hallway. They were discussing the renovations and mentioned something strange. Parts of the library had been closed off for years, even before the current work began. "They say it's because of structural issues," one of them said. "But I heard from the old staff that they found some weird stuff in there years ago. Like bones. Too big to be animal bones, but not quite human either." I didn't sleep that night. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that room. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the shadows, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I know what I felt wasn't imagined. They say nothing ever happens in the countryside. I used to believe that, growing up in our family's ranch house tucked away in rural Colorado. It was a quiet life, mostly surrounded by the vastness of open fields, the occasional chirping of crickets at night, and the cool mountain breeze that rolled in. But there's one night I'll never forget. It changed the way I think about the stillness of the countryside, and maybe even the safety of my own home. It was June, one of those unrelentingly hot nights when the air itself seems to press against your skin. My parents had gone off for a week-long trip to the Rockies, leaving me, Luke, their 20-year-old son, in charge of the property. My younger brother, Jonah, had plans with his girlfriend and wasn't expected back until the next morning. The ranch house was modest but old, with creaky floorboards and doors that protested when you opened or closed them. That night, around 1 a.m., I was sprawled on the worn leather couch in the living room, aimlessly flipping through channels. The windows were wide open, hoping to catch a breeze that would cut through the oppressive heat. The only light came from the television, a dull glow that flickered on the walls. I was halfway through some late-night rerun when the motion sensor light in the yard snapped on. Its harsh beam spilled into the living room through the open windows, stark and unnatural. My heart gave a small jolt. Jonah's home early, I thought, or maybe a deer wandered too close to the house. It wasn't unusual out here. But when I walked over to the window to glance outside, there was nothing. No movement. No deer. No Jonah. Just the empty expanse of our front yard, glowing eerily under the light. I shook it off, telling myself it must have been a bug or a moth flying too close to the sensor. I returned to the couch and grabbed my phone to send Jonah a quick text. "Hey, are you on your way back?" No response. Not even the little typing dots. I set my phone down and leaned back, trying to let my heart settle. It's amazing how much a person can convince themselves that they're safe in their own home. I was doing just that when there was a knock at the front door. Not a polite knock either. It was a sharp, insistent rap. I froze. For some reason, I didn't immediately get up. It wasn't fear, not yet at least, but a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. After a moment, I walked over to the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. The porch light illuminated the wooden planks of the deck, the shadow of the overhang above it, and nothing more. There was no one there. A chill crawled up my spine despite the heat. Maybe it was Jonah, trying to pull some dumb prank. That's the kind of thing he'd do after a couple of beers with his friends. I grabbed my phone again and texted him, "Seriously, are you outside?" Still no reply. As I turned back toward the living room, a sound cut through the silence. A knock, this time from the window behind me. It was so sudden and so close that I jumped. My heart hammered as I whipped around to face it. Nothing but the black glass, reflecting the faint glow of the TV. And then I heard it. A voice, or rather voices. Two of them, speaking in unison. One was deep, almost a growl, and the other was high-pitched, like a child's. Together they said, "We see you." My body went cold. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my imagination, maybe the TV, but I knew better. The sound had come from outside, clear and deliberate. My throat went dry. "Jonah, this isn't funny!" I yelled, more to break the silence than anything else. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. There was no response. The only answer was the oppressive quiet of the night. I ran upstairs to my parents' bedroom, where I knew my dad kept his rifle locked under the bed. My hands shook as I unlocked the case and loaded the weapon. The act of holding it gave me a small sense of control, even as my mind raced with questions. Who were they? What did they want? And, most importantly, why my house? I decided to do a sweep of the property, starting with the barn. If Jonah and his friends were pulling a stunt, I'd catch them out there, laughing and probably drunk. The yard was silent as I stepped outside, the rifle in hand. The motion light had gone out again, leaving the world draped in shadow. I walked toward the barn, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounding unnaturally loud. The barn door creaked as I pushed it open, and I shone my flashlight inside. It was empty, just the usual tools, hay bales, and the faint smell of livestock that clung to the wood. Nothing seemed out of place. On my way back to the house, I scanned the tree line. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement. No figures. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath. When I got back inside, I locked every door and window I could find. The old house groaned in protest, but I didn't care. My heart was still racing, but the logical part of my brain tried to reason with me. Maybe it was kids. Maybe it was my brother. Or maybe I was just overreacting. Then came the screaming. It started suddenly, breaking the silence like glass shattering. It wasn't words, just raw, animalistic shrieking, full of rage and chaos. It came from the front door, along with the sound of fists pounding against the wood. My blood ran cold. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't trying to scare me anymore. They were trying to get in. I bolted to the living room window, threw it open, and aimed the rifle into the darkness. Without hesitation, I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the fields, a sharp crack that silenced everything for a moment. The pounding stopped. The screaming stopped. And then I heard footsteps, quick, heavy, retreating footsteps, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with the rifle in my lap, every light in the house blazing. My phone buzzed once, hours later, with a text from Jonah. Sorry, stayed at Ashley's. Everything okay? I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say. The next morning, when the sun finally crept over the horizon, I went outside to check the yard. There were no footprints. No signs of anyone. Just the empty, sunlit field stretching out in all directions. I never found out who, or what, visited me that night. My parents laughed it off, proud of me for handling it, like a true rancher. But it wasn't a laughing matter to me. I moved out a year later, but sometimes, on quiet nights in my new place, I think about those voices. I think about the pounding on the door, the screaming, and the footsteps retreating into the darkness. And I wonder if they'll ever come back. It was a chilly spring night, somewhere around midnight. I was home alone, savoring the quiet after a long day. My parents were out of town visiting relatives, and I had the whole place to myself, a rare occurrence I both cherished and dreaded. To keep myself company, I was on FaceTime with my best friend, Emily. She was doing the usual, ranting about work, her latest dating disasters, and how her cat kept knocking over her plants. As we chatted, I wandered aimlessly around the house. My bedroom was on the second floor, facing the street, so I had a decent view of the quiet suburban neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. At some point, I passed by my window and froze. There, standing on the sidewalk across the street, was a man. He was still as a statue, staring directly at my window. "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's someone outside." Her face scrunched in confusion. "What do you mean, someone?" I turned the camera to show her, but the streetlight was dim, and the man was just a shadowy silhouette in the distance. "I don't see anything," she said, sounding more annoyed than concerned. "You're imagining things. Probably just some guy walking his dog or something." But I knew better. There was no dog, no movement, just him, staring. Feeling uneasy, I called my mom. She didn't hesitate. "Turn off the lights, close the curtains, and ignore him," she said, her tone firm. I did as she suggested, but my curiosity gnawed at me. Peeking through the curtain, I saw the man again, closer this time. He was on the sidewalk in front of my house, his face tilted up toward my window. My stomach churned. "Emily," I whispered into the phone. "He's moved. He's right outside now." Emily's voice turned serious. "Call the police. Don't wait." So I did. The dispatcher sounded calm, almost too calm. "Is he on your property?" "No, but he's standing right outside, staring at my house. Unless he's trespassing or causing a disturbance, there's not much we can do," she explained. "We'll send a patrol car to check the area." I hung up, feeling both helpless and exposed. Minutes later, I saw the glow of red and blue lights as a police car rolled through the neighborhood. It slowed near my house, its spotlight sweeping over the front yard. When the officers didn't find anyone, they drove off, leaving me to fend for myself. The man was gone, at least for now. Relieved but still rattled, I FaceTimed Emily again. She tried to distract me with funny stories, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Eventually, I crawled into bed, phone still clutched in my hand. 20 minutes passed. Then I heard it. A faint, deliberate click, click, click. It sounded like it was coming from outside, near the side of the house. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But then the noise grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Pulling back the curtain just an inch, I saw him. The man was climbing the trellis outside my window. I froze, paralyzed by fear. His face was clearer now, illuminated by the faint moonlight. He was middle-aged, unkempt, with wild eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I dropped my phone in a panic, the clatter startling him. His gaze snapped to mine, and for a moment, we locked eyes. Then, he reached for the window. I screamed, "Help! Somebody help me!" The sound of my voice echoed through the neighborhood, and lights flicked on in the houses around me. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Grayson, came running out, his booming voice cutting through the night. "Hey! What the hell are you doing? Get down from there!" The man hesitated, then jumped from the trellis and bolted down the street. I called 911 again, barely able to get the words out between sobs. Within minutes, the police were back, but the man was long gone. They searched the area, interviewed neighbors, and assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night. "Do you recognize him?" one of the officers asked. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I've never seen him before." Mr. Grayson chimed in, recounting what he'd seen. "He looked like he was trying to break in. If you hadn't screamed, who knows what would have happened?" The officers took my statement and promised to follow up, but their assurances did little to ease my nerves. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with all the lights on, a baseball bat clutched tightly in my hands. Emily stayed on the phone with me until the sun rose, her voice the only thing keeping me sane. The man never came back. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every creak, every shadow, sent my heart racing. I installed cameras around the house, replaced the locks, and avoided staying home alone. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. The police never caught him. But I'll never forget the way he looked at me through that window, like I was prey. My name's Sam, and I live in a small town in northern Wisconsin. Population? Around 3,000 if that. Life here is slow, uneventful. On good days, it feels cozy. On bad days, it feels suffocating. I've got a few hobbies to keep me sane: photography, hiking, and lately Instagram. I'm not a social media junkie, but I've built a modest following, about 300 people. Just enough to make me feel connected to something bigger. This all started on a Thursday night. I was curled up on the couch watching The Shining for the umpteenth time when my phone buzzed. A new notification. Someone had followed me, Holly Grace. I clicked on her profile. Holly was stunning, blonde, vibrant, always smiling in her photos. She had over 5,000 followers, and her feed was like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Beach trips, brunches with friends, gym selfies, and candid shots with her dog. It all looked so real. There were tagged friends in the comments, likes pouring in, nothing about it seemed off. A minute later, another buzz. She'd messaged me. "Hey! Just stumbled across your profile. You're really cute." I stared at the screen for a moment. Me? Cute? Holly looked like she belonged in LA, not lurking in the feed of a small-town nobody. But I replied, "Why not? I mean, it's Instagram." We started chatting. Holly was friendly, funny, and weirdly relatable. She mentioned she loved basketball, which happened to be my favorite sport. She'd gone to college in a neighboring state, and we even shared a love for cheesy horror movies. Before I knew it, an hour had passed, then two. By the end of the night, she'd given me her number, and we were texting. It felt surreal. I kept asking myself, why me? Why would someone like her be interested in someone like me? But she was. By Friday afternoon, We planned to meet at a local bar called Lucky's. It's the kind of place where the jukebox plays old country songs, and the beer is always cheap. Holly said she wanted to see where the locals hang out. Friday night came, and I was nervous as hell. I parked outside Lucky's a little early, sitting in my car and fiddling with my phone. That's when Holly texted, "Hey, my car's acting up. I'm stranded about 15 minutes from the bar. Can you come get me? Please?" I called her, but it went straight to voicemail. She texted again with a location, some stretch of road just outside town. I hesitated. Something about it felt off. But then I thought about her photos, her laugh and the voice memos she'd sent earlier. She seemed genuine, and honestly, I didn't want to come off like a jerk. So, I started driving. The road she'd mentioned was one I'd only been down a couple of times. It was flanked by dense woods, with no streetlights and barely any traffic. About 10 minutes in, I spotted a car, a black Nissan Altima, parked on the shoulder. Its hood was up, but the scene looked strange. The car was too pristine, almost like it had been staged. I pulled over and parked a few feet behind it. The windows were tinted, and the interior was completely dark. I got out calling her name. "Holly? Are you here?" No response. I moved closer, the crunch of gravel under my boots unnervingly loud in the silence. I peeked under the raised hood. Nothing seemed wrong, no smoke, no visible damage. Just a clean engine. That's when I saw it. A hand? It slid out of the driver's side window, palm up, as if beckoning me. But it wasn't Holly's. It was large, masculine, and the nails were filthy. Panic gripped me. My chest tightened, and every instinct screamed at me to run. "Holly?" I called again, my voice shaky. Still nothing. The hand waved slightly, motioning for me to come closer. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, the hand disappeared. I turned and sprinted back to my car. I barely had time to lock my doors before the Altima roared to life behind me. Its headlights stayed off as it pulled onto the road. My hands shook as I threw my car into drive and floored it. The dark road stretched endlessly ahead, and the Altima followed, keeping its distance but matching my speed. I tried to think. My phone was on the passenger seat, but my fingers were too unsteady to dial 911. I knew I had to lose them. I turned onto a side road, killing my own headlights to blend into the darkness. My heart was racing so hard it hurt. I took another turn, then another, zigzagging through the backroads I'd grown up on. Eventually, I pulled into a small clearing near the edge of the woods and cut the engine. The Altima never passed by. I sat there, trembling in the silence, for what felt like hours. When I finally made it home, I was too shaken to sleep. I grabbed my phone and went straight to Holly's Instagram, desperate for answers. But her profile was gone. Not just unfollowed, completely gone. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started Googling her username, hoping to find some trace of her account. That's when I stumbled upon a Reddit thread about fake Instagram profiles. Apparently, hackers steal photos from real people to create convincing accounts. They use them to lure victims, usually men, into dangerous situations. I did more digging, eventually finding Holly's real account. The girl in the photos was a real person, but she lived states away and had posted warnings that her profile had been hacked. I still don't know who was behind the Altima. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I came way too close to finding out. Sometimes I wonder if they've done this before, if anyone else has been less lucky. It's been months, but I still check my rearview mirror constantly. Every dark car feels like a threat. So, if you ever find yourself chatting with someone who seems too good to be true, trust your gut. And if they ever ask you to meet them in the middle of nowhere, don't. I was a shy, introverted 18-year-old, the type who stayed late at the library or found solace in empty classrooms. My evenings were predictable: classes, a quick dinner alone, and then more studying until it was late enough to head back to my tiny off-campus apartment. I liked the solitude. It made me feel in control. One night in late October, I had a 2-hour break between my last classes. Instead of heading to the cafeteria, I decided to eat in one of the basement classrooms of the humanities building. These rooms were old, with flickering fluorescent lights and a faint musty smell, but they were almost always empty. It was my sanctuary. That evening, I sat in the back corner of the room, quietly eating a turkey sandwich while going over my notes. The place was completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I liked it that way. But just as I was finishing up, the door creaked open. A guy stepped in, a student I assumed, though he didn't seem to belong here. His appearance was unkempt. His hoodie was stained, his jeans were torn, and his sneakers looked like they'd been through hell. His messy hair partially obscured his face, but I could still make out his sharp, sunken features. There were plenty of open seats, but he walked right past them and sat down next to me. I remember my stomach dropping. The proximity was unnerving. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken in hours. "Hi," I mumbled, focusing intently on my notebook. "You're here a lot, aren't you?" he asked. That caught me off guard. I glanced at him, confused. Yeah, sometimes. I've seen you before," he said. His lips curled into a small, crooked smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Always alone." The comment was innocuous on the surface, but it felt like a jab. He wasn't wrong. I was always alone. I tried to shrug it off and return to my notes, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze lingering on me. After a few more awkward moments, I stood up, muttering something about needing to go. I packed my things and left, my heart pounding as I climbed the stairs out of the basement. Instead of heading straight to my next class, I decided to sit outside on a bench in a quieter part of campus. The air was crisp, and the faint rustle of leaves in the trees helped calm my nerves. But my peace was short-lived. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head and froze. There he was, standing halfway behind a cluster of bushes, watching me. He must have followed me. My throat tightened. I tried to act like I hadn't noticed him, hoping he'd just go away. But he didn't. After a few moments, he emerged from the bushes and started walking toward me. "Hey, sorry if I scared you," he said, sitting down uninvited on the bench. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just to talk." His tone was casual, but something about it felt wrong. "What's your name?" "Evelyn," I lied. He nodded slowly. "Evelyn. Nice name. Where do you live, Evelyn?" My heart raced. "Not far," I replied vaguely, already planning my escape. "Which street?" he pressed. I stood up abruptly. "I have to go." I didn't wait for his response. I walked briskly across campus, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Sure enough, he was following me, his pace quickening to match mine. Instead of heading to class, I made a beeline for the parking lot. I reached my car, got in, and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine and pulling out. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief until I was several blocks away. That night, I decided to skip my usual routine. I went straight home, locked every door and window, and tried to focus on anything but the strange encounter. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why'd you leave so fast, smiley face?" My blood turned to ice. I didn't reply. Over the next hour, the texts kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "Your house is cute. Are you scared? You should let me in. I'm outside." The last message was followed by a loud knock at my window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned toward the window, but the blinds were down. Then I heard his voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Evelyn, open up. I just want to talk." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator what was happening. The knocking stopped, but I didn't dare move until I heard the sound of sirens outside. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the area but found no sign of him. They assured me they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood but admitted there wasn't much they could do unless he came back. The next morning, the college sent out an emergency alert. A man matching the description of my stalker had been spotted on campus, reportedly carrying a knife. The campus was shut down for the day, and students were urged to stay indoors. I told the police everything, but he was never caught. Over the following weeks, I changed my number, moved to a different apartment, and avoided being alone as much as possible. To this day, I don't know why he targeted me or what his true intentions were. But the memory of his crooked smile and the sound of his voice outside my window still gives me chills.